life will present you with people and circumstances to reveal where you're not free, right? So when somebody does something that elicits a guttural experience, you could feel nauseous, you could feel angry, you could feel upset. The opportunity is to see, not to dismiss it and not to bypass it, but go, okay, what's actually afoot here? What is being triggered? Because it's always going to be something that's old, because it's associated with today, but today isn't the source of the experience.
So no doubt you know what you should be eating, you know you're being too hard on yourself, you know you need to slow down, but you're still not doing those things. But it isn't about lack of discipline or effort by any means. Today my guest is Peter Crone. He's known as the mind architect, and honestly I was nervous interviewing this man. He's a way of finding the thing underneath your behaviour, the belief you don't even know you're carrying, and he does it very fast. When he names it, then it's very hard to unsee it. So what we're talking about today is why you keep going back to the same patterns, the snacking, the self-criticism, the rushing, the putting yourself last, not at a surface level, but at the root. Because until, I suppose, you deal with that, what is actually driving the behaviour, nothing is going to change long term. So if you've done the work and you're still stuck, this one is definitely for you. I'm Rebecca Holland and welcome to the Health with Holland podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, today I am joined by Peter Crone, often known as Mind Architect. Peter works in a very unique way, in real time, with people he helps uncover unconscious beliefs and internal narratives that are quietly driving stress, self-pressure, conflict and limitation. Rather than giving advice or strategies, he exposes the programming beneath the behaviour, and when that programming is seen clearly, it often dissolves. Peter, so grateful you're here. You do such amazing work globally. It's really an honour to have you on this show. And all the time I was researching you and listening to you, I'm so blown away by you've skipped like 10 steps, how quickly you get to what needs to be gotten to very fast. So you can see that in real time when you work with someone. And I absolutely love when you mention the quote, "Until the unconscious mind is made conscious, it will ruin your life," by Carl Jung. But you demonstrate that in real time. So I want us first really get into that piece and we can go from there.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's lovely to be here with you, Rebecca, and I appreciate the tip of the cap to my seemingly increasingly becoming known skill of breaking parts, limitations that other people can't see. It's definitely fun and very fulfilling. Did you have specific questions about it or the process or?
Yes, so I would love to know how it actually plays out in someone's everyday life, because you demonstrate it so well when you have somebody on front of you and they've been for a long time doing mindset work, they've done therapy, they've done somatics, but they still feel very stuck. So for example, you had a woman on and it was like a penny drop moment for her. You started to just ask very significant questions by reading her body language, her answers. And very quickly you seem to have got to the root cause of what was really stopping her make change. And when you look at a person who really was trying her best so hard in so many ways to make change in her life, but she kept being stuck. It was like there was a glass ceiling she couldn't seem to break through. But that day you could see it was like an aha moment. She said, okay, now I know how to move forward. And how does that work for you? How did you get into that and so quickly getting to the root cause of what's really the issue?
I think it's just sort of an organic process by virtue of my own life, where I went through a lot of trials and tribulations. You may know, part of my history as a kid, my mum died of cancer when I was 7, and then my dad worked on the ferries between Dover and Calais and Zeebrugge in Belgium. And he went to work when I was 17, never came back. And so being orphaned at the age of 17, you can imagine, sort of injects a certain amount of adversity for a kid to try and figure out life. And so I think to begin with, it was really the adaptation of my own survival mechanisms of having to become very vigilant about understanding human behavior. Why were people doing what they were doing? I would assert from a very, self-preservation kind of perspective. But then as I got past it and I realized that life is life and things happen as exactly how they're meant to happen, as hard as that is for us to sometimes comprehend or accept, I still had the skills of very observant abilities of seeing human behavior and more so listening to language. I became fascinated with words and why people say what they say. And I was able to sort of reverse engineer their quote unquote problems they were speaking about to some sort of fundamental foundational belief they must have if that's the way they view things, right? So
Yes.
if someone was saying, like, I used to live in LA and there's no good men in LA,
Hmm.
that's their reality, but it's clearly not an objective fact, right?
Hmm.
And so, really, what it would help me see is maybe that person underneath has obviously had a lot of hurt in relationships, has had felt rejected or not wanted. And so, maybe what drives that commentary is less about what's the actual demographic of men in Los Angeles and more to do with the fact that that human being feels that they're not lovable. And
Yes.
so that's what happens when I'm working with people. I'll hear their problem, and usually within the first couple of minutes, I already know. It's sort of like David Copperfield-esque, like magic. He just then takes you on the journey to reveal where the elephant's hidden.
Hmm.
So then my questioning for the observer seems, wow, super astute and specific because it is, because I already know where I'm trying to get them to.
Yes, that's very interesting to highlight that often we're operating from what we think is fact because it's a deeply ingrained belief, but
Yeah,
facts aren't feelings.
yeah,
So you're uncovering that in a really intuitive way. And I think that's the magic of it because a lot of the time you work with a lot of people who are high performance and have done years of therapy and mindset work. But
yeah,
again, they're repeatedly coming against them beliefs that they're not even made conscious yet. They're
yeah,
completely unconscious, going back to that quote. And
yeah,
that's what I find so fascinating to watch that because there's obviously a massive art and skill to do that. But just for the general population, everyone listening, people are struggling to do that. So even listening to that and knowing that it's like a detective work almost for themselves if they have to do it,
yeah.
that trying to uncover what for years has been a blind spot.
No, it's not for the faint of heart, and it definitely takes a certain degree of aptitude to be able to even reflect. And I think that's why relationships are so important, particularly with good friends or family, to have somebody who can hold us to account or reflect in a way that might give a perspective that we currently can't see. And I think that's the beauty of life is we're all walking around with our own sort of bespoke blind spots that we need to transcend in this lifetime. And I would assert we even arrive with them, which gets a little esoteric, but it's
Mhm.
not because your dad said you're a useless, athlete or your mum said you were a mistake. Those are
Yeah.
horrible things for a kid to experience, but actually they were more what I call epigenetic, emotional epigenetics, where it turned on an internal perspective that was already there that the soul that you are is here to reconcile.
Mhm.
So for the individual at home, yeah, I have all the compassion in the world, which is why I feel so moved and grateful and humbled by the millions of people that are finding my work. So that whether it be through a podcast like this or my own podcast where I work with someone, or they witness one of my live events where I'm working with someone in the crowd and they're like, oh my God, that he might as well be talking right to me because that's
Mhm.
exactly the same thing. So we get to have that sense of liberation and emancipation through comparison sometimes, because at the end of the day, humans are so fundamentally different and yet so fundamentally the same,
Yeah.
and when it comes to these narratives, it's what I'm writing about, these 10 primal prisons that everybody's got. We just tend to gravitate to one or two that become,
Yeah.
stronger in the way that they define us.
Okay, 10 primal prisons. I like that because it's so true. It's so repetitive. It's just like the sheep and wolves clothing or that kind of
Yeah,
analogy because you often hear, oh, I met someone exactly like my father, even though he presented very different initially. But actually, at the end
yeah,
of the day, they both had a terrible temper. And I
yeah,
think that really encapsulated. There's so many people experiencing something really similar, even though we're all so uniquely different. But that really strikes a chord, I think, especially when you think of all the different scenarios that can play out. So yeah,
hmm,
very one to think about. So just on that note, I think I've heard you before talk about how we attract people and situations that mirror our internal beliefs.
yeah,
And why do we actually unconsciously recreate them patterns? Because a lot of us have huge amount of self-awareness. People regularly read the books about attachment and
mm,
they understand their patterns. But
yeah,
still, even though they know, the nervous system wants a familiar hell, they understand what to watch out for, but they are continuously repeating them patterns that don't serve them. For example, an easy one is just picking the wrong partner multiple times. But why
yeah.
is it happening when people think, wow, I have massive self awareness, I've done the therapy, I've done the mindset work, but I'm still doing this?
Because thinking that you've done the work doesn't mean that the work has been done,
Yeah.
right?
That's
So it's humbling, right? Because as a human being, regardless of IQ and EQ, And to your point, everybody could have done workshops, seminars, therapy, coaching, whatever, and they might think that, whoa, like I've really seen that particular attachment wound or that abandonment wound or that trauma. But these things are so insidious, they sit deep in the tissues as a somatic experience more than a sort of cerebral knowing. And that's what guides us. So the reason that we keep attracting those same circumstances is because ultimately the fundamental lesson has not yet been learned. And there is that comfort with familiarity, even though familiarity could be quite, painful.
Yeah.
So I think, it's a very fascinating, but also, as I said earlier, humbling journey to be human, where regardless of how educated we've become, how successful we've become, how even well-known people become in the world. Like I've worked with some of the most quote unquote famous people around the world, and they've got millions of dollars, they've got millions of fans, and they still might be being driven by the belief that they're not good enough. On paper, it doesn't even add up, but because it's so ingrained into the tissues, it really takes some serious excavation to be able to get beyond that. And that's why we could argue that, being human is the greatest game, because it's not easy. If it's easy, it's like I often give this analogy. It's like if you as a mum, which you are, walked in and, at some point, maybe your kids are playing a video game and you watch them and their character, their avatar is just walking across the screen. And then it goes, welcome to level 2. And then you watch and they just walk across the screen and it goes, welcome to level 3. And then you see this and you're like, what are you doing? Like, they're like, well, you just walk across the screen and then you go to the next level. And you're like, wait, so there's no like demons or enemies or adversaries? Like, no, that's it. Well, what's the point of the game, right? So we recognize it in other utilities, but when it comes to human experience, we're like, I wish there wasn't so much freaking difficulty or struggle. But that's what makes it so potent and powerful, is because if you can really get to the place where you have upgraded and overcome these levels, that's euphoria. That's the greatest form of achievement, is self-emancipation.
Yeah.
But it does take a lot of work, and it does take a lot of reflection, and certainly being with people that genuinely have your best interests at heart, truly care, are a safe space to speak into, and hopefully have some wherewithal.
Yes, yeah. I think when you talk about that person, who has done quote unquote the work, but they're still coming up, like the athlete you spoke about, who on paper have a lot of things. It is, in your mind, most people are completely limitless and boundless in so many ways. That is so true. And I really think like mental prisons stop us live this safe life, which actually is, as you say, dangerous because you're not living to your potential. But that person, like you kind of alluded to earlier on, there is levels of work to do, and it's not an overnight thing. So when you're working deeply with someone, they are going right down to the bottom to come back up, I suppose. What does that look like when you're actually working with someone and you can see they're at the cusp of change? What are the things that kind of tip them into really, as you say, going down to the tissue to make change like long term?
Yeah, it takes a discerning eye and mind to, one, be able to see what somebody else can't see, and then also for them to have the vulnerability and the desire to get beyond that. So the way that I do it is, I will hear the story, which then automatically in my system reveals the deeper constraint. And then through a series of questions, getting that person to recognize what is it that you felt that is similar to the way you feel now when you were a kid, so we can make that association. So for example, I was working in my mastermind, which is my 3.5-month container. It's my most powerful offering, where we work every other week for about 5 hours, and you go on this journey. I do a syllabus and people go through this incredible transformation, and I coach people in the afternoon segment of the day. And I was talking to this woman, very moving, from Brazil, and her dad was killed when she was a kid, murdered by people from his own work. And she had, for the entire time since she was a child at 9, when it happened, thought that it was her fault. And now she's a grown woman, she's a mum, and she saw that gave her this sense of like invisible prison that she was living in, where she was super conscious of, how is she raising her kids because it's all her fault, or how is she showing up at work because it's all her fault. And you can start to feel the exhaustion of that, right? And so my skill slash opportunity is to reveal the underlying programming. What is that fundamental piece of code that somebody's whole persona is built upon? And so in her case, to answer your question, I take them to that deepest level of what I, call that fundamental prison. And then we ask, what does it feel like to live inside of that? And the tears come out. I'm exhausted. I just feel so much shame. I wish I could have done all of the world of, suffering that people could anticipate when you're living in a prison. And then the next step is I will do what I say, investigate the validity of it, right? Is it an absolute truth that it's your fault? Not what you feel, not what you think, but is it an absolute truth? And of course, it never is. It's just what we think. And then when people can see that, the relief, the breathing patterns, I immediately see change. The shoulders drop because the level of constraint they've been living in, which has become normalized, starts to dissipate. And so the essence of who they are, their physiology changes. I mean, I've seen miracles in terms of even diseases that just vanish within a month or two once the psychology has now reinformed the physiology from a state of safety as opposed to fear or fight or flight. So that's the process, is to be able to reveal the core structure of their identity based on a fundamental lie and a fear. Make sure they see that it's not true. And then when you see it's not true, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
Then, so that's the awareness part, bringing the unconscious conscious. Then, depending on the age of someone, the older someone is, the more ingrained the habit is. And so then it's a matter of practicing being the person without that constraint, right?
Yeah.
Who could you be in the absence of thinking it's your fault? Well, she's like, whew, I could feel so relaxed. I could feel so free. So now she gets to practice being that woman,
Mm-hmm. What you said there is almost terrifying in the sense that when you do the work she did and you get to the other side and you realize, wow, I have huge power. When I remove them kind of shackles, I'm actually extremely powerful. And that's very uncomfortable for people. I can imagine that takes time to actually fully acknowledge that, because when I listen to your work, sometimes I almost feel fearful because I think I am the person who's putting the barriers around myself, stopping me going to the next level.
Yeah.
And that's actually really something people don't think about. They think, how can I be good enough rather than great? And then, of course, you realize, whoa, I can be great. And then you kind of panic because you think, wow, I have a lot of things to do in order to be great. And obviously, that's where your very powerful work lies. When you're bringing someone like that woman, she's beginning to just realize, oh, I'm actually quite limitless. There's a lot of things I can do. Then the next level is what happens then in your work with someone. How do they transition to a completely different, the mental prison is almost gone.
Yeah.
And they're in this new environment now and they're wondering, whoa, how do I behave in this new environment?
Very well articulated. I mean, it's pretty much one of my most common lines when I'm working with people, because I'll ask, for example, her, who could you be in the absence of that belief that it's all your fault? And sometimes for her, she was like animated. She's like, oh my God, I feel so free. I can do anything. I can, stop worrying about what I didn't do right, or, get out of this blame and shame game. But for some people, they're like, I don't even know what that would feel like, And so the line I use is, I'm introducing you to a world with which you're not familiar.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like a birth, without sounding too poetic. It's a spiritual birth to the real essence of you. And that, as you said, can be scary because you're tapping into the essence of your real power. So now you go from being victimhood. It's much easier to point fingers at mom, dad, boss, life, politics, and be, quote unquote, in that position of, I'm a victim of circumstance. But once you realize, no, I've created my own constraints, I've created my own prisons, now you step into 100% responsibility. And not everybody's ready for that. Much easier to have somebody else be the reason why you're, not somewhere, not someone, or you're upset. So yes, it's not for the faint of heart, but it is unavoidable, because to me, every soul is here to access that sense of liberation and responsibility.
Yes. Wow. It's almost like when you speak them words, I know myself and anyone listening is probably thinking, ooh, it's like a big quest, almost a quest in your life to get to that level. And I think a lot of people are very tired of the self-improvement kind of game where it's all quite surface level and you're trying to fix yourself like for a long time. And there's that massive narrative online where people are saying, I just need to fix myself a little bit more, like lose fat. And they're still like on a kind of superficial level of thinking self-improvement is going to bring
Hmm.
mindset improvement. And I think that's something that it's like, let's bridge the gap now for that person that's doing self-improvement for years, but is never actually getting to the depth of going to bring the subconscious to the conscious.
Yeah.
What's like explaining to that person that's coming to you and they said, I'm just at a dead end.
Hmm. Yeah, self-improvement is very seductive, and obviously there's a million books out there on self-help that I say eventually become shelf help, because they just
Yeah.
sit there and you don't necessarily use them. But invariably, the things we're drawn to that we think we need to improve are really the reflection of the underlying prison that we still to reconcile. So if somebody's trying to become successful financially, and there's a million books on finances, typically what it's actually revealing is that they don't know their inherent worth. So maybe they grew up in a family where their brother or their sister was a better athlete, a better academic, and so their story that's still defining them is that they're somehow less than. And if they're living inside of a world that they're less than, it doesn't matter how hard they try, you can only manifest to within the degree that you've got a view of yourself and life, right? So that's the power of consciousness and our own identity, is that we are going to fulfill on it. Like we will find evidence for our beliefs, right? That's the way it works. So self-help, okay, you can maybe nudge the needle a little bit, but what I share with people that can be both profound but also painful to hear is that domain, all you can become is the best version of your limited self.
Yeah.
What I'm doing, when people see that, it's like, oof, that hits. And what I'm doing is like removing limitations, which then taps you into the essence of who you are as a limitless, timeless, boundless being, which for many people is even hard to comprehend. And I understand that. But it's really recognizing that who you are is pure potential, masquerading currently as the idea of a limited being or a limited human. And that's very normal, but it's not who you are. It's how
Yeah.
you become misidentified, without getting into politics or religion. Even when somebody says that they are a religion, if someone says, I'm Christian or I'm Hindu or I'm Muslim or I'm, Jewish, or that's not a truth. It's an identification. And typically one that was not even chosen because you were born into a family and basically told that's who you are.
Yeah.
So it's not even a personal sovereign choice. And yet it will define how people think, how they feel, and how they behave, right? So it becomes this container. So I like to use analogies. Think of water as pure potentiality. You could have a glass of water. So the water is water. It can go on any shape, but it's now being contained by the glass. You could pour that into a vase if you're putting some flowers out. It's slightly bigger, different shape. You could pour it into the sink, and now you've got a sink full of water. You could have a bathtub of water. You could have a swimming pool. But so the water doesn't really care, like spirit, like essence. It will take on the shape of the container. What is the container? Your conversation about yourself. So essence can be anything, but if you're walking around thinking you're not enough, you're not wanted, you're not safe, then essence will mold to that and life will reflect it.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful to be able to understand that, because that is the genesis of everything that we create. If someone wants better results, they can try as hard as they want to change actions, but their results are still going to be commensurate with the view they have of their own identity.
And it's like almost understanding you have the blind spot and you're trying to find your blind spot essentially. And then the person that's always trying and not really feeling like they're getting anywhere, it's like really actually recognizing if I take a step back, I'm really realizing I'm not seeing the full picture because you're only seeing one limited road
Yeah.
you're on. And then obviously change as well is going to take a lot of repetition. But you can't do repetition of something until you know what it is. So it's like
Yeah.
that depth of, even the talking about it, the uncovering it, the reflection, the journaling. There's a lot of like digging to get really into understanding. And then that's still not as much as you need a lot because like you hear a lot of people say, I do talk therapy, but they were like, I didn't benefit from it though. They were just repeatedly saying the narrative, but they weren't getting to the depth of what were really the barriers to them. So I think
Yeah.
there's like a massive amount of, oh, we have so much self-awareness. Isn't that amazing? But self-awareness isn't enough when it comes to making that long-term change. That's what I struggled with for a very long time, doing so much therapy, journaling, reflection, somatic work. But I was like, I could tell you, I could tell the therapist. The therapist is probably like, wow, she's given me a therapy session at this stage. But you really, that's like not, that's just a scratch of the surface. To
Yeah.
actually live it, embody it, really realize, like I could have done a year or two of therapy and say, okay, I want to meet the right man. But, and I've talked about it, and I know what I want, and I know my limiting beliefs around dating, and still I'll walk into the same patterns. So I think
Hmm.
that's like the distinction that's so important when people are trying to make change. They're not realizing that, oh wow, awareness is like just one part of this. I have to dig deeper. That's not enough just talking about it.
Yeah. True. And I think the subtle distinction is even change, which on the surface looks like the word itself, change, is still typically a reaction to something deeper, right? So, for example, if somebody thinks they're not good enough and they've lived like that since they were 5, 6, 10, through their teenage years, and now they're in middle management or they're even C-suite executive, but they're still being driven by that. What that might manifest as is they work harder, they go above and beyond to cover other people's, workload that they don't carry. It's not their responsibility, but they take it on. So it might look like change when they're like, you know what, screw this. Like, I'm not going to keep picking up Bob's slack, but they'll show up somewhere else where I need to go to the gym more. And so change it's kind of like, putting different clothes on the same mannequin, right? I often use the analogy of, say, you have like a 500 square foot little studio apartment somewhere that you live in as, pied a terre or whatever, but you bought it as an investment and it was really run down, shitty carpet, stained, mold behind the walls. The drywall was, just falling apart, wallpaper peeling off, the amenities inside of it weren't working, all the appliances were broken, but you got it for a good deal. And you're like, I'm going to really do it up. And maybe there was somebody who is a contractor or an interior designer. They saw it as a good project. They rip up the carpet, they take it down to the studs, they put in new insulation, they get rid of the mold, they put beautiful mahogany wood floors, they put in the highest, like top of the line appliances and beautiful furniture. And friends come over and go, whoa, this place is like insane compared to how you bought it. That's change. But what didn't change is it's still the same size space. And that's what humans typically do is they live in a prison that they're oblivious to, and all they're trying to do is make it more comfortable on the inside.
Ooh. Ugh. That's one to digest. Yeah, that's very true. It's just
Yeah.
like you say, your problem can just, you don't have the problem at work, but you bring that problem home, or like you say, to the gym. It can sometimes, it's like a chameleon. You turn into a chameleon of changing where the problem just manifests.
Yeah.
That's a very significant one to remember, because I'm sure a lot of people, they think they made the change, and
Hmm.
then this similar scenario presents itself down the line, but just in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think when someone says as well, I'm quite upset because of them, it's like when you're giving your power over to someone, I really like how you talk about this. Somebody else is upsetting you and they have the power and the control over you. And I think that's something that people will, I suppose, really think about and ruminate a lot, how upset other people make them. How do you deal with that when people are coming to you and there's something significant upsetting them and hurting them that's because of another person in a relationship, and all their control is there? How do
Yeah.
you work with someone to move away from letting other individuals have a lot of control over their happiness and their well-being?
It's a great question. And I think first we want to start with compassion because we've all been there. I think it's very human to think that we are at the effect of life, right? Meaning that somebody did something, said something. And it doesn't mean that it's a subtle one because we don't want to become so isolated and disconnected that nothing affects us. Then you become robotic, right? So there's a difference between, being free from your circumstances, which is a lot of what I teach, but it's also being free within your circumstances, but recognizing where is the power, right? So being upset because somebody did something or said something is human, but understanding that that's not actually what's upsetting you, rather their actions or their words revealed something, right? So that's one of my more popular quotes. I say, life will present you with people and circumstances to reveal where you're not free, right? So when somebody does something that elicits a guttural experience, you could feel nauseous, you could feel angry, you could feel upset. the opportunity is to see, not to dismiss it and not to bypass it, but go, okay, what's actually afoot here? What is being triggered? Because it's always going to be something that's old. Even if somebody does something that, moralistically, objectively by society, we could all agree is, mean or not pleasant. A very powerful, realized human who is comfortable in their own skin is not going to have the same reaction as somebody who's still defined by their trauma, right? And so that's the work. And so to answer your question, I will help people to be able to reverse engineer. Okay, somebody did this, or somebody left you, or somebody cheated, or somebody stole money, or somebody said something mean. I understand that's not pleasant, but it doesn't necessarily warrant the experience you're having, right? When the punishment doesn't fit the crime in terms of our emotional reactions, I will use the expression of, if it's not life threatening, it's just ego threatening. So there's something within you that is feeling this abandonment, that is feeling this injustice, that is feeling this betrayal. And that's very human. But what's the genesis of that? Where did we start to experience that? Because it's associated with today, but today isn't the source of the experience.
Yeah.
And so that's where usually sometimes these memories are hard to even access because they were difficult. And as a kid, we don't always know how to cope. And so they sometimes get just sort of suppressed or pushed into the dark recesses of our minds and our bodies until such time life will bring it back to the surface so we can do our own healing, right? But that's not for the faint of heart. As I said earlier, that's for people who really want to emancipate themselves. For a lot of people, it's an opportunity to drink, to rebound, to smoke weed, to get a prescription from a doctor. And so if you're really committed to being a liberated human, which to me is the only reason we're here, then you're going to look deeply at what is underlying that upset and reaction.
Yeah, that's something I think about regularly when somebody has a reaction that seems really intense for what would say the crime was. It's
Yeah.
always something that I'm curious about because it's obviously it's something very tied to a past scenario they've had, and their response
Yeah.
is very linked to that. So that was so liberating for me when I started to look at anyone who had a really negative reaction, were really angry or hugely upset by something. I'm like, okay, I'm really curious as to what happened in the past that reaction was so big, and it didn't fit in my eyes what the crime was, wrong word, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's very liberating thing to really look at things like that and understanding we're never really in reality. We're just working off the script of our past and the state our nervous system is in that moment. And I find
Yeah.
that is hugely, it gives a lot of freedom, I suppose, when you think, hold on, am I operating off fight or flight or freeze or fawn, or am I in rest and digest? Because I'll see
Yeah.
the scenario completely different, but also what's happening 10, 15, 20 years ago that's shaping everything I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah, and again, it's beautiful, it's painful. We've all been there. It's shaped much of who I am, and my work is,
yeah,
I've been very informed by, for me, particularly romantic relationships, those attachments, those bonds that, I'm not somebody who loves lightly. I tend to be like very, very attracted to, attached to whoever my partner is. And when that ends, whether it's on my side or theirs, that brings up a lot of my stuff from my parents dying, or, and it took a lot for me to be able to look at that, both make space for the little boy who's feeling the angst, the nausea, the sadness, but at the same time, see that in real life, this is precisely what had to happen, and that can be sobering. It doesn't necessarily mitigate the suffering, but it is powerful to realize, oh, things can be different because they're not.
yeah, 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 yeah,
And that is not a catch-all for liberation, but it can help to take off the edge, of realizing, okay, my system right now is in the state of fight or flight or in resistance to life, but it would be, I use this metaphor all the time, be as asinine as going outside and pointing up at the sun and saying the sun should be over there. It's like you'd never do that. And
yeah.
so as part of the construct of nature, everything's unfolding and we're not disconnected from that. We're not separate from it. And so to understand that for some reason, whatever's playing out, whatever people are struggling with right now, that's precisely what's happening. And it's only you're saying, I don't want it, I don't like it, it shouldn't be that way, I could have some, all of those narratives are what are creating the resistance. When we
Yeah.
have profound acceptance of life, even though subjectively it may not be our first preference, I understand that.
Yeah.
I've lost a lot of money on the stock market once. It's not what I wanted. So I could either accept the money's gone or or see the money's gone and be upset about it. It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like one or the other, and
Yeah.
that takes again an educated mind and someone who's mature enough to not be at the effect of life, as I said earlier.
Yeah. That's interesting when you think of like, we'd often say, oh, I really regret that. I'd be somewhere completely different if I
Mm.
didn't choose that. Like someone said the other day, oh, imagine you didn't get separated 5 years ago, how different your life would be. But I was like, but I did. So
Yeah,
this is my life. And there's
yeah,
many paths you can go down, but there's a massive strength in total acceptance of the path you did go down. Because,
yeah,
especially when it's financial stuff, stock markets, you think to yourself, oh, if only I did that differently. If only, and it's like in real time, you didn't have them options. And I think there's a lot of work to be done for like the acceptance of the road you're on, even if it's a really crap road you're on at the moment, and
yeah.
knowing that there's many paths ahead of you, and you're just going to choose another path, and
Yeah.
that takes a lot of, I think, courage and strength to really understand that.
And surrender, there's, I think, the expression I use is like let go and don't know, right? So let go of your history and don't know your future. But
Yeah,
that's not an easy place to navigate because, we could get really philosophical here about free will and predestiny and all of that because it looks like we have choice, right? But choice is a byproduct of our conditioning. I use this example as a simple analogy. Before I studied Ayurveda, which is the healing arm of yoga, similar to Chinese medicine, I didn't know some of the protocols of how, for example, you could help a sore throat, as a very simple everyday example, where you could gargle with some warm water, some turmeric, a little bit of salt, and that was one way to help mitigate. Before that, growing up in England, you go to Boots or some sort of pharmacy and you pick up lozenges, tunes, Ricola, that choice to go and do something in reaction to symptoms was predicated on what did I know? So when you know more, you have the illusion of more choice, but more choice is still being dictated by your conditioning. So it looks like, and this is where people can be super hard on themselves with guilt and shame about the choices they made, because a day later, a week later, certainly a year later, we're more educated, we have more intel, right? And as you can look back and go, oh shit, I should have done that. Right, but when you made the choice, you were functioning within the level of awareness that was available to you at that time. And so what it breeds is an immense amount of self-forgiveness that even though we might hurt as a byproduct of our choices, hurt is one thing, but then to have guilt and shame is another that only amplifies suffering. So, to be able to accept our history, knowing that we made the best choices we could at every turn, that it is revealing at some level things that we're here to realize and trust that. And then as it relates to the future, first of all, we're never in the future. This is an eternal now, but it looks like there's a multitude of choices we could make. But in reality, there's only one, which is
yeah,
the one you end up making, right?
yeah,
So it gets I know it gets a little heady, but so then we can start to remove the pressure a little bit of trying to make the right choice, because at the end of the day, there's no mistake, because everything that you're doing is ultimately to reveal wherever you're not free. And it doesn't matter if you date Sally or Mary, or you get a job in, London or Wales, you're there and you're here as a human being to transcend the constraints with which you arrive. So it sort of becomes not moot in terms of our choice. We want to feel that sense of, being empowered and that we're sovereign. But at the end of the day, you're still going to have to face whatever your limitations are,
yeah,
and that for some people can be demoralizing or disempowering, and for others it's very liberating. It's like, oh, I can't really, excuse my French, but I can't really fuck it up. It's like
yeah,
whatever I do, I'm going to still have to face the limitations that I'm here
yeah.
to escape from.
You actually have less limitations though when you acknowledge that, because you're saying, okay, I'm just going to give it a shot. Like in Ireland, everyone always says, what's meant to be for you won't pass you by. And that's
Yeah.
like very comforting. But also in that scenario, you have to realize every single time you're in that present moment, you have a certain set of limitations that are there and you have a few paths in front of you in that moment. So it's like almost, you're so right. It's actually so freeing to just be like, okay, I can't really fuck this up because I
Yeah.
completely understand that I only have a certain amount of knowledge and understanding in that moment. So the choice I made is the choice I made. But I think in my 20s, I would have been ruminating so much over things, regret, regret, regret. And then in my
Right.
30s now, I'm like, I'm not ruminating over it because that
Yeah.
understanding. And that's extremely powerful.
Yeah, it is. And also the statement you used, of what's meant for you won't pass you by. I would say it's not inaccurate, but it's insufficient because what it means is, like I said earlier, you'll find evidence for your beliefs. So what's meant for you won't pass you by. But what that's saying is you're actually just going to get what is a reflection of your conditioning. So it's appeasing it's sort of, you know, um, lidocaine or whatever it is, like it's numbing for the ego, right? It's sort
Yeah.
of this painkiller um, for your ability to go, oh, that's cool. I can't mess it up that way. That's not really what I'm talking about because
Yeah.
what's meant for you won't pass you by could be what's meant for you is to attract abusive partners because that's how you're currently wired. So don't worry, it's not going to pass you by. But it's only because of your current wiring. So
Yes.
we want to have some stake in the wiring. We want to be able to analyze and understand our own conditioning so that what's meant for us becomes more of a conscious choice as opposed to just an unconscious reaction
Yeah.
of like, well, why do I keep attracting the same partner, the same circumstances, the same financial situations, the same physical limitations or sickness? Well, yeah, what's meant for you won't pass you by because of the way that you're currently programmed. What we
Yeah.
want to be looking at is how can we constantly, and this is why I do my 3.5 month mastermind, is to reveal what I call the current operating system of humanity, which is designed to survive. That's its overarching intention. It's
Yeah.
based in limitation, fear, suffering, disease, scarcity, and dysfunction. That's the way that the human operating system is currently wired. What I'm
Yeah.
introducing is a new operating system.
Yeah.
So that then gives you access to new what's meant for you won't pass you by because you're coming from freedom, from
Yes.
love, from vitality, from abundance, right? So you think about the world as, I often say the universe doesn't have a budget. In the quantum, everything is available. It's all there. What we're accessing and manifesting is a reflection of our current code.
Yeah.
It's not what's available. I've heard the expression and used it a lot. What you think is possible is not what's possible.
Yeah.
And that's powerful, right? Because
It is.
even
Yeah.
even some of the most incredibly intelligent people that I've gotten to work with, which is some of my favorites, they realize that their imagination is their greatest
Yeah.
threshold, meaning their greatest inhibitor, right? Even as good as it is, we've got people out there who are super creative, but beyond that, there is just a world of pure possibility that most people have no idea how to access.
Yeah. I'll give you an example of that. Around 2016 or 2017, I made, your stereotypical vision board and I thought I was aiming for the stars.
Yeah.
Got everything on the vision board, but it was not anything that was in line with my values. So when I was quote unquote manifesting these things, the partner, everything, even the twins were on the vision board. That's 4 years before I had them. Everything was on the board, but a lot of the things just weren't in line with my values because I was limited to that very, the way I saw myself,
Yeah.
the way I didn't really process things that went on in the past. There was so much reasons why they were the things I put in the vision board. And then if it was a few years later, my vision board would be completely different because again, it's learning, it's pushing through the limits. It's just kind of mind blowing to think that that phrase that so much people will use, and in retrospect they'll say, well, you got what you got. That was what was meant for you.
Yeah.
And that's actually very dangerous because you're saying,
Yep.
you got what you deserved almost because that's the confines of your environment, your life, your mental capacity. So there's
Yeah.
a lot of levels up. And I love the way you mentioned that. You're like deep diving with clients to go up the levels of depth. Because right now, that would say use a vision board for the example. Their vision board is like level 1. And they have
Yeah.
the capacity to go up to level 10 of
Yeah.
things that are way past what they can dream about.
Yeah, it's one of the favorite things I teach in the mastermind is what I call vertical ascension
Yeah.
versus linear progression. So self-improvement and self-help is linear progression. You know, you go from hopefully, a nice house, you leave, you become independent, maybe you go to university, college, whatever, then you get your first job and you're kind of struggling, you got minimum wage, but maybe you live with a couple of roommates so you can cover the rent, and then eventually you kind of get a promotion, you make a bit more money, and you're like, fuck it, I'm going to get my own place, but it's still a little sketchy. But then maybe you meet someone, you combine incomes, then you get a little cute, slightly too bigger 2 bedroom apartment. Then you're growing, and now you're in your late 30s, and you're like, we want to get a nice home, and you move to the suburbs, and that's linear progression, right?
Yeah.
You haven't actually gone anywhere, you've just changed your circumstances. What I'm talking about is an internal shift in the way that you actually identify who you are. That's
Yeah.
an entirely different proposition. This is the new operating system where the linear progression is a very redundant model. You're basically dragging your history around with you and you're doing your best to just sort of, gentrify it and make it look prettier.
Mm.
What
And
I'm
that's what
doing
most
is
people are doing.
that is the majority of humanity. I would say that's 99.99% of humans. It's not wrong, there's no judgment, but it's exhausting. So as you said, that was what you deserved, or that's what meant for you. That can become apathy and resignation,
Mm.
where you just become apathetic to life. What I'm interested in is tapping into the true vitality of what it is to be alive and recognize the potentiality of the soul we are versus
Mhm.
becoming misidentified and defined by the limiting human that we're not,
Yeah.
right? And that's an entirely different proposition, which, courtesy of what I'm doing, I'm very grateful because now more people are becoming aware of that, which I think is why millions of people are, enamored with my work. Because the old system of self-improvement or fixing or changing, it's just unfulfilling. It doesn't work anymore.
Oh no, absolutely not. And it is definitely global recognition around that and understanding the human brain so much more and the energetic point of it as well, that
Hmm.
things are so nuanced and there's so little things black and white when it comes to that. And I think that's a phrase like you see it a lot thrown around, you're more limitless and you have more potential and you can reach much higher, reach for the stars, that kind of narrative. But in order to do that, you have to you can't just say, okay, I'm going to get the Lamborghini, um, in the next few weeks, and you have a low paid job. What's stopping you get the Lamborghini is your mind of saying that's out of reach, and
Yeah.
then of course you're not going to do the steps in between. So that's so true. There's a lot of steps.
It's
When
like I use the metaphor of a radio because, back in the day, we showing our age, when we used to listen to a radio where you had to change frequencies versus listen to Spotify or whatever people do these days, we understood that the quantum represented by music everywhere in the air, we can't see it, but these radio waves that we're surrounded by, you've got everything from beautiful classical music to R&B to smooth jazz and hard rock or whatever it is. It's all out there. So the question is, to what degree are you tuned in to the frequency that is aligned with what you're consciously saying you want?
Yeah,
So you get what you deserve is really the analogy where you're tuned into a particular frequency because of your upbringing that is giving you the correct music, even though subjectively you're saying, but I hate hard rock. I want to listen to smooth jazz. Yeah, but you're not actually wired for that. So
yeah,
it's available, but until you shift your current frequency in the way that you have your own internal narratives and dialogues and conversations about yourself, then it becomes you only access that occasionally through force. That's where people talk about willpower. Yeah, you can overcome a habit temporarily, but you can't violate your identity.
yeah.
And that's something super powerful for people to understand.
Yes, it is, and that's a really nice note to think about and finish off with because I think even listening to this entire thing and talking to you, I'm thinking to myself already, my brain's thinking, whoa, where are all the glass ceilings? And
Hmm.
I'd say a lot of people are the same, they're resonating with that. And understanding as well, a big point we didn't touch on is your environment is obviously creating a lot of these beliefs as well. That's why so much people say, a few weeks ago, me and my kids went skiing and just been away for that week, gave me such a fresh perspective of people in that area of Andorra are living very differently. The culture is different, etc. If I moved to Andorra, I'd be also operating and
Yeah,
living in a different way as well. So acknowledging the environmental piece is also
yeah,
important. You can change the environmental piece.
yeah.
Sometimes that it really has to be addressed. So
Yeah. It's a vicious cycle because who we are attracts our environment, who we are creates our environment, and then we become defined by it, right? So
yes,
that's where it gets really sticky. It takes a lot of effort to want to break out of our own identity at one level, but then that will become the precursor to generating a new environment, which could include different people, different partners, different
yeah,
jobs, different locations, which then that new environment helps to reinforce the new identity. So it's this, at one level, a beautiful feedback loop, but sometimes that feedback loop can be self-deprecating.
yeah. And you also have to live in the frequency and get into the frequency, as you say, very often to allow
Mhm.
yourself to dream and feel that it's possible. And I think
Yeah,
that's a big barrier to a lot of people. They're never actually in the frequency of joy, happiness, self-belief. And then, of
yeah,
course, you're just going to keep attracting what's your frequency, your
yeah.
radio frequency. So I absolutely love that. Peter, where can people find you?
Best place is on the social medias of Instagram, and that's just at Peter Crone. So everything is just my name. So my website is petercrone.com.
Yeah.
Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, they're all Peter Crone. It might be Peter Crone, the mind architect, but it's all just my name. So
Yes, brilliant. Peter, thank you so much. I have a lot of reflection to do after this. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so
good.
much.
Well, I hope it was inspiring and maybe moving for your listeners. And if people want to go deeper, then depending on when this comes out, we just started my mastermind number 9, but mastermind 10 will probably start in beginning of August. So if that's something where people want to really do the work, I would assert it's the most powerful experience anyone can go on.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you, Mida.
So we know at this stage, awareness on its own doesn't really change behaviour. Your nervous system has to feel safe enough to do something different. And that's what the Rebalance membership is built around, simple daily steps that regulate your nervous system so that the change you want to make actually becomes possible. Just small, consistent actions that your body can actually follow through on. That's where the real change actually happens. And that's what we do together inside Rebalance. The link is in the show notes. And Peter, thank you. This one I will not forget in a hurry. And I will see you in the next episode.